Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Art of Procurement. And first of all, please excuse my, the nasaliness, if that's a word, of my voice. I'm come down with a little bit of a cold and stuffiness, so I'm attempting to be as clear as I possibly can. So hopefully by next week, this thing will have moved out of my system and we'll all be good to go again. But today I actually have two guests on the show, Jon Hansen and Kelly Barner. So both Jon and Kelly are very passionate about procurement, and they've chosen to play really proactive, highly visible roles, I think, in helping inform and educate, essentially, our community as they continue their pursuit of really helping to elevate the role of our profession. Kelly, you'll know as owner and editor of Buyer's Meeting Point, and she is our first repeat guest on the Art of Procurement. So Kelly spent time discussing supply market intelligence, and specifically how you can turn raw sources of data into actionable insights. And you can hear that interview all the way back in episode 6. Jon Hansen is a successful procurement entrepreneur who turned speaker, radio host, and I think investigative reporter, it's fair to say. Jon founded the Procurement Insights blog all the way back in 2007, and he's fast approaching, if he hasn't already hit the milestone, of his 1000th Procurement Insights radio show on Blog Talk Radio. We invited both Kelly and Jon onto the Art of Procurement to discuss their newly published book, and it's titled Procurement at a Crossroads, Career Impacting Insights into a Rapidly Changing Industry. I spent the last few days devouring as much of the book as possible, pretty much reading it from cover to cover. And today's interview on the book is really challenging, but it's also highly gratifying. I think that you're probably aware, for most of the discussions, I head into the interview with at least a flow of how I think the conversation will go. I want to make sure that I do what I can to help the guest tell a story, if you will, and also just to make sure that we're able to bring as much value out of that conversation as possible in each episode. Well, today, I think I pretty much ripped that up after a couple of minutes. My conversation with Jon and Kelly, I think it's part interview and part debate. Basically, I think what you're going to hear is three people who are really passionate about the future of procurement, also see the challenges that we need to overcome and may stand in our way. And we basically debate what we think is necessary to play a leading role in the organizations of today, but also in the future. Okay, well, before we do get started, I want to let you know that if you haven't done so already, you can sign up to be notified every time a new episode is published. You can just head on over to artofprocurement.com/subscribe, pop in your email address, and you'll never miss another show. As a thank you, I'll send you a couple of reports that we've featured in the past on the show. The first one is one that will really help you in your procurement job search if you're looking for a change, and it's called the 21 Tips to Help You Secure Your Dream Procurement Job. The second one is to help you examine the health of an existing supplier relationship. I have a number of steps that you can take which really allow you to look at an engagement to determine if you think it's going to ultimately fulfill its requirements, and it's something that you can use when you part way through a contract. So to get those two reports, to ensure you never miss an episode, you can go to, again, it's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Okay, well, with that being said, let's go straight into the discussion with Kelly and Jon. Hi there, everybody, and as I mentioned there in the pre-show introductions, I'm delighted to be joined today by Kelly Barner and Jon Hansen to discuss their new book, which is called Procurement at a Crossroads. So, Kelly and Jon, welcome to the show.
I'm happy to be here. Kelly?
Always happy.
Thanks. Well, one of the things actually I was interested to ask you up front, and we were kind of talking about it before we started recording, is I I think, John, it was you that labelled you both as kind of an odd couple from the outside. So I was interested to know how you connected and kind of how the relationship blossomed, if you will.
Well, okay, you know what? I'll turn this over to Kelly because, again, when we talk about this, and I think this is a story we'll be telling our grandchildren, respectively. But let's put it this way: the comparison is that Kelly is the Paul McCartney and I'm the John Lennon. I'm the bad one; she's the good one. Although, I've talked to her a little bit. I think there's a little bit of darkness in her. But
your influence is coming through.
I get blamed for it. There you go. No, okay, but Kelly, I think it's an interesting story. Talk about how we met, because I think that goes to speaking to the fact that I'm not the lone wolf here in terms of stirring things up.
No, definitely not. So actually, if we go all the way back to the beginning, in a manner of speaking, I inherited you. So when I joined Buyers Meeting Point in 2009, you were already sort of a mentor to the organization, and there was an existing relationship there. But I had to kind of learn the ropes, come into a pre-existing organization. And relatively early on, there was an online, I guess you could call it a debate, but at the very least, it was a strong difference of opinions between you and someone else very prominent in the field. And I all of a sudden realized, having been in procurement for years and having sort of pre-established notions about whose opinion was the most important within procurement, I realized that you were really taking a different position. And so I needed to decide, am I going to continue to align myself with this guy who's willing to cause some trouble and stick his neck out if he feels strongly about something? And so I did my research, I did my homework, and at the end of the day, I made the decision that if I had to ever go back to that moment and justify my decision to continue working with you, I would have consciously made a point of saying, yes, this is a guy I want to continue to work with. I agree with his approach. I may always agree with his opinion, but I know that everything he says comes from research and quality hard work. And so I made the decision in that moment. I didn't tell John the story for maybe 5 or so years later, but I made the decision in that moment that John's opinion and advice was something that I wanted as part of my professional journey, as well as in shaping what Buyers Meeting Point would become.
Well, I think the interesting point is that, and this goes back to the origins of this, and again, that speaks to Kelly's commitment to work together, because she certainly did get warnings about writing the book with me. She did. People said, "Are you sure you want to be associated with this guy?" The fact remains is that, and we sort of briefly touched on this beforehand, and the content. I don't know if you're going to talk about it. I'm sure you will, Phil. But the fact remains is the world has expanded so rapidly in terms of sources of information from the time that Kelly talked about, when there was this, I won't call it a confrontation, but a difference of opinion. Mm-hmm. And certainly the person to whom she's referring is someone that, people would at one point in the past genuflect before. And I didn't have that same sense, not for the sake of being disagreeable, but let's face it, there are certain issues that we had to bring out in the open, and the content and the type of coverage and the type of information that I was doing back then was looking at news, was going into real issues that affected the procurement world, as opposed to the somewhat vanilla approach of really covering the industry from the standpoint of our features, functions, and benefits. Today, technology isn't overwhelmingly intimidating to this generation. I mean, we're moving into terabytes in wearable technologies. Right. And so what's happened is they want to know more about the people behind the company. They want to know more about the truth of the impact of that technology. They don't need somebody to make them feel comfortable to make the decision or wear belts with suspenders. They can tell which technology is right for them. And Kelly, you rightfully pointed out that, today there's no real difference in technology. You can't go wrong with anyone you choose by the very nature of it. It then becomes even more imperative to have this viewpoint that will put you in a position where some people aren't going to like you or be happy with what you have to say, because you're challenging them to think outside of the narrow scope of what they did before, which was talking about product and technology and solutions, as opposed to, again, the industry and the reality of the impact of that technology. I mean, technology is really a supporting player, not the star of the show. And I think that reality is being reflected in how people are looking for information today. Does that make sense, Kelly?
It does, and it's funny listening to you talk about that. It makes me think how interesting with all of these things changing. It's almost like we're saying that procurement is at a crossroads. And it's funny because it was never our original intent, as a matter of fact, when we were working on the book to talk about now. Our real goal was to talk about the future. Mm-hmm. But as we looked at all of these shifting things, and whether it's generational differences or changes in global trade, the impact of social media, the altering role of technology, we realized that now, in fact, is the moment that all of these things are going on. And much like I had to do my research and make a decision, everyone within procurement right now, in their own set of circumstances and their own unique context, has to do the exact same thing. This isn't a scenario where you get to just sort of stand still and cover your eyes and wait for the change to go away. Because if you were to do that, when you uncovered your eyes, I think the landscape would have shifted so significantly that you wouldn't truthfully recognize where you were anymore. Right. I think the change coming to procurement, it's exciting. It's at times a little bit scary, but the opportunity is expanding at such a rate that we really do, as a professional community even, need to stop and think about where we're going to go, look at the opportunities, and start to get ready to be able to seize them.
You talked at the beginning of the book about there being three tensions that are really shaping where we're going as a profession. I just wondered if you could kind of go over them and expand upon them a little bit, what you found when you did your research in the book.
You take that, Kelly.
Yeah, so very early on, and this was part of actually us pulling that together, was right at the pivot moment when we realized we were no longer going to be writing a book about the future. We were going to be writing a book about now. Mm-hmm. So we outlined these three tensions, as you said. So it's the difference between what we were built to do, which is very transactional, leveraging economies of scale, that kind of thing, and what we're being asked to do. It's a changing relationship between how companies work with their supply chain. So as Procurement Group in the UK has talked about, there's this corporate virtualization where companies are no longer predominantly handling things in-house and only working with suppliers for maybe transport or peripheral things. They're real and meaningful core parts of making an operation work. That's shifting, which is going to have a big effect on procurement. And then the last one is that even though what we do has changed and how the company works has changed, we're still perceived in very much the same way we were in the very beginning. And so not only are there these tensions about what is versus what needs to be, there's this misalignment between how we want to be seen and how we're actually perceived by our internal cross-functional colleagues. Mm-hmm. John, would you add to that?
Okay, well, wait a second. I'm going to throw something out here. I'm going to say, but whose fault is that? That misperception of where we want to be perceived and how we are perceived.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a lot is down to the way that we portray the value that we bring to an organization.
See, I
agree.
But you see, I think there's an element of that there. But I think, and I agree with Robert Hanfield's assessment here, and even more to the point, Kate Vatasek saying until all the old dinosaurs have died out, there won't be any real change. I think there's been long existing a Rodney Dangerfield, I get no respect mindset that has permeated the industry, largely because many in the industry have fallen into the profession. Remember, Kelly, at the conference where we spoke, you joined us remotely in Virginia, and we said how many people chose to be in the procurement industry or be there as a profession? Remember that?
I do remember that.
Now two things, Phil, that came out of this is, number one, and it was a little bit of an improvement. In the past, when I'd asked that question, if you got like 1% of the audience raising their hands, that was good. Here we had a bigger percentage.
Right.
But we then asked the next question, how many of you looking at your decision now with a couple of years experience in the industry, would still choose to be in procurement. And 50% said we would have chosen another profession.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that for a second. You've transitioned from people who have fallen into the industry to people who've chosen to be in the industry who now wish they weren't in the industry. So what that tells me is, by and large, the fact is that the industry and the professionals haven't defined themselves yet. And that you have somebody who fell into it and saying, well, I'm not really sure why I'm here. And Kelly, remember at the beginning of the chapter you said, procurement was a place they'd send people to get rid of them?
Absolutely, yeah. That's a Charles Dominic point, that it was the island of misfit toys.
Well, so you have this original history of being, outcast and, just being somebody in there where you didn't get respect. Then you have people coming into it who are looking and saying, you know what, we're not really liking this. There's too many rules that tie us back. There's too much of the old existing mindset. There was a variety of reasons given for that. And I think a lot of the fact is that that's based upon the mindset of the procurement professionals from the past. Hence why Hanfield and Vitasic have said, until that mindset changes, including this intermediary group, and the new generation comes forth and embraces and takes over the procurement industry, I think we're going to be locked into this thing of, don't say anything, keep your eyes down, and just hope you keep your job. I mean, that's my take on it, and I think a lot of it is self-inflicted.
Yeah, something that's interesting that I came across, sorry Kelly, that I was talking to Brian Umbenhauer last week, who's the head of practice sourcing and procurement at Deloitte, and he was talking about the 2016 Deloitte survey that was recently published, and essentially saying that procurement still is not a destination. For high performers, it's a step on the ladder and they move out because they can then go and have greater influence elsewhere in the organization. So you've got on the one end folks, as Kelly said, maybe being pushed into the profession that didn't want to be there because it's a place to put them. On the other hand, the high performers are leaving because they can be more influential elsewhere. So how do you fix that?
Oh, hey,
well, I'll start with that one.
I think
it's incredibly frustrating. And I can remember being there via video conference when Jon was having that sort of entire room panel conversation in Virginia, and thinking to myself, okay, so you've now potentially sat here, in some cases, in front of your boss and coworkers, and raised your hand and said that you wished you were working someplace else in the organization. So who's holding you back?
Mm-hmm.
As someone that loves this profession, and I certainly didn't, grow up wanting to be in procurement, but I love working in this field, and I want to work side by side with people who share my enthusiasm. And so I think it's frustrating that on the one hand, we're held back a little bit, maybe by our own hesitancy to self-promote. I think maybe there's a very generalized part of the procurement personality that keeps us back from slightly more flamboyant functions like marketing and sales. We're held back by people expecting us to be very hesitant to self-promote, but then we're held back by these people that don't want to be in the field. There's only so effective you can be. And I think if, in fact, we're going to make effective, lasting change, people that have a vision, even if it ends up being wrong, as we admit near the end of the book, that's completely a possibility. But people that have a vision and are enthusiastic about it and want to see it come to fruition need to start communicating more and talking more enthusiastically about our successes and just being more ambitious for the function and for the profession in general. We are, in fact, I think, going to have to, in a positive way, sort of fight our way out of the position that we find ourselves in. And you can't do that with an unwilling army.
Well, you see, I agree with that to a certain extent, but I also go this way as well. You can't do that, and this isn't a shameless plug for the book, although it may sound like it. You can't do that without finally talking and bringing to light the tough questions that have been sheltered and hidden beneath the surface for all this time. Do you know what I mean? How do you define yourself if you're not truthfully looking at yourself in the mirror and looking at your strengths, weaknesses, good, bad, and everything else in between. And I'm going to go back to that again. I think that the book, from my perception, is a call to action. It's a call to stir things up. It's a call to make people feel uncomfortable, because change doesn't occur in comfort. But it's only when you get to that point of being so uncomfortable that you have to do something. And that's the whole thing about it. But there's that inherent element of the pressure that forms a diamond, if you will. And I maybe I'm saying procurement, the profession is right now a diamond in the rough. But I think we need to put pressure points on. I think we need to challenge the sacred cows. I think we need to take a run at things that we haven't been doing. And until we do, and until we're ready to do that, I don't think we'll progress. That's
Sorry, John, I was going to follow up, and you mentioned in the book, there's a couple of things. You talked about call to action, and something that stood out to me was that I think the quote was from Tim Cummins of IACCM, that almost 50% of purchasing professionals are going to become redundant over the next few years if we carry on kind of the way that we're going, because maybe through irrelevancy, but also through automation, because those are very transactional roles that we still do for a lot of intents and purposes. But you went into some findings on how others perceive procurement, because I think this is really important when we start thinking about how we need to change how we sell ourselves. So what did you find in terms of how others outside the profession look at us, what the outside view looking at?
Okay, there's a couple things. This goes back to 2007 and a CPO agenda roundtable where senior executives got together, CPOs in the industry, and talked about executives. And what I found interesting is the majority of people believe this, that the best person to run a procurement department is someone who doesn't have a procurement background. Mm-hmm. That says everything right there. That simple statement. And you know what's funny is it's become less and less incendiary over the years, but it still puts people off. You know, when I make references to that, you know, and I'm in front of a live audience, I know there's one or two of them would like to give me a punch in the face. But the reality is that is where it starts and finishes, is that perception that we're a functional appendage of somebody else that is merely there to follow orders. And one of the lamentations came from someone who joined a major company. And he said, look, you know, when I was with my previous employer, I was actually involved in the capital expenditure discussions. I was actually involved with the planning process. We're now with this new company. I think it was Nestle he's with, which I thought was very brave because, you know, it listed him. He said, I'm basically, the decision's already made. I'm given my marching orders to just go out and do it. And I think that's the whole factor that comes into play here. So the outside perception, if you will, is that, you know, procurement professionals going back to 2007 were the Gilligans of the SS Minnow. You know, I hope you know what I'm talking about when I say that, right, Phil?
It's above my head, I'm afraid.
Okay, Kelly, please.
Okay, so I'll say this first. I wasn't old enough to see it on first run, but Gilligans Island was a very silly show, a ship that went aground on some funny island, and this odd cross-section of people had to learn to function sort of right out of nature with their, you know, and they were all sort of the traditional archetypal personalities. There's the glamorous lady, there's the retired couple, there's the goofy guy, and the SS Minnow was the vehicle that transported them there.
There were categories. Actually, it was actually a silly series, Sir Kelly, because I was alive when it first aired. Thank you for pointing out that painful thing. But basically there were the different personalities. But Gilligan was the lovable goofball. And was the star of the show, but you know he was basically a goofball, and I think procurement's profession, and I think largely because people didn't choose that. Remember, people chose to get into finance. People chose to get into technology, but in the procurement world, let's face it, I mean, the CIO, CFO has been around for a long time. CPO is relatively new by comparison. Most people, again, fell into the profession. So there was this sort of like no person's country, and whoever was available would take the job. That old joke is that, if you're out of the room, you're likely going to be volunteered by everybody else for a job nobody wants. I mean, I think that's really what transpired here, and that's the deeply rooted inferiority complex that exists, that has been in there, and that leads to the acceptance of the outside view, and so it's this feeding of this poor self-image within procurement, and the professionals decide to see themselves. Which, by the way, and here's an interesting thing: a few years ago, the strategic importance of procurement has been routinely recognized by everyone, and speaking at conferences throughout North America and even overseas. The what you call, I guess, the migration of finance people into the procurement world has been, quite steady, and that's because, again, procurement people were seen as not being the best equipped to manage now what has been recognized as strategic importance. So the irony here is even the importance of the industry and what we do, it's actually jumped us. Has the perception of our value as professionals. And I think that's changing with the new generation coming in. I'll go back to, again, what Hanfield and Vitasic said. This new generation, they're more militant. They're not intimidated by technology. They're choosing to be in the industry as opposed to falling into it. I think that's where the big change is got to happen, because that's where the perception is. And that doesn't mean that the existing people in procurement can't make the change or don't have the IQ or the ability to make the change. It's a matter of whether or not they'll want to. I mean, I liken it much to my mother's refusal to deposit money into an ATM machine when they first came out, because she didn't trust them, because she wanted to see the face and the eyes of the person to whom she was handing over her money. I mean, there's some things that are inherently ingrained into how we perceive things, and that's the reason why Hanfield and Vitasic, who we've referenced in the book, said that. So, again, going back to your original question, Phil, or your point, I think the perception of what procurement is partly self-inflicted and partly fed by our origin and our acquiescence to how other people view us. And that, I think, is going to be the big change that's happening. I don't know, Kelly, do you agree?
I do agree. And I think in terms of taking a first concrete step that allows us to make some changes, then, what are we supposed to be working towards? I think one of the ideas that we've shared in the book is that internally, the first step towards changing that perception is better alignment. And Laura Ciceri used to work for Barton, I believe, and she now works at Supply Chain Insights. And she has this great idea that she talks about as in the organization, there needs to be a function that effectively is focused on make, buy, deliver. Mm-hmm. And so it pulls together operations, procurement, and supply chain and aligns them, as opposed to having procurement aligned with a reporting into finance or something more administrative. And it was interesting because after having long liked that idea, and again discussing it in the book, talking about the fact that we need an operational revolution, just last week I was in a webinar where Nike's head of procurement was talking about some of the changes that they've made and how they've accomplished the things that they have. And several years ago, they did precisely that. They took procurement out from underneath finance and they aligned them with a group that reports up to the COO. And it changed everything because it changed both perception of them and it changed their actual priorities and assignments. And so for anybody that was unconvinced about this perspective change through the new reporting structure, seeing procurement working on new kinds of things in new kinds of ways sort of took that mind shift through the last hard mile in convincing people that not only is this group worth a second thought and not what you initially thought they were, but boy, this is an important team of people. This is a strategic function. Nobody at that point would dismiss them as being administrative because you wouldn't dare.
Yeah, and that's something I hear is repeatedly as alignment and influence, and really where we got to go, because as a function, I think a lot of time we kind of work to our own beat, if you will, that we've focused on cost savings. We know that cost savings gets us a check in the box. It allows us to continue, in the short term from one year to the next, but it does nothing for our long-term sustainability. So we need to be more relevant to our organization, and that's where alignment comes in. I think there's no silver bullet in terms of how we get there, but there's a number of things that we can do that collectively allow us to build our influence with the leaders of the organization so that we can sell more of what our value proposition can be and deliver more than just the old cost savings way of old, because that's kind of the number one way for us to become redundant, I think. I was interested
But can I just interrupt for a second?
Sure.
But the way to align is to abandon this Oliver Twist, can I have some more gruel, sir, mentality. And that's really the thing. We've talked about getting a seat at the executive table. It seems to be an ongoing thing. It never stops. The reality is that you don't ask for permission. I'm of the belief is you do it, and it's easier to ask forgiveness than it is for permission. And I think part of the big problem that our industry has to come to properly align, because let's say I'm going to say this. I think procurement is already aligned with procurement's already aligned with the market, with expectations, with all the key players. It's almost like on autopilot. It's just that we haven't gone into the seat to take the steering wheel. Everyone knows procurement is strategic. Everyone knows the impact, especially as we move towards a globalized supply chain. We don't have to become aligned. We have to take ownership. And I think that's the biggest challenge facing procurement professionals. Alignment is already there. The importance of procurement is already established. The strategic requirement for doing it right is there. Technology is no longer this obstacle that obfuscates the real challenges we need to address. It's assumed its role as an important supporting player in the equation. But at the end of the day, we still have to be willing to step forward and take the reins and take ownership and take responsibility. And I don't think at this stage there's enough procurement professionals willing to do that. Because, again, we still want to be nice with each other. We still feel that, we have to, and not with just each other, but just in general. There's an excuse me, please mentality that's almost like, what they accuse Canadians of being, which I am, which is we're awfully polite. We don't want to offend anyone. Well, the reality is I think procurement professionals, until they have the mindset that they're going to offend people and that they're going to claim, and catch up with where the profession is because we're lagging behind, I don't think alignment is possible. I think the alignment we need is between the professional and the profession, not between what procurement can do within the enterprise. That's just my take.
Do you truly think, though, that there's that it is well recognized, the value that we can bring? Because I don't see that. I see it's very spotty. So there's some organizations that absolutely do believe in the value and the strategic nature of what we can do, and there's others that have such a bad experience of working with procurement in the past that all they think of us as being a transactional kind of button pushing. The old stereotypes. It's hard to shake those stereotypes, and I don't see that everybody has kind of made the move from that.
But here's the difference. Here is the difference, and this is the key, is it's no longer optional. Mm-hmm. Companies realize now that the competitive advantage, you see, we can't say, well, procurement has a role to play, and we have to align that without there actually being a role to play. We're not growing into a role of influence. Procurement, the function, already has influence. It's already recognized importance there. You mentioned that procurement people, you see, what you just referred to is not an issue of procurement. It's a relationship issue. It's the people within procurement, Phil. That's what you just highlighted as the problem with what you said, is that people have had a bad experience working with procurement. People have had this. Mm-hmm. That isn't a procurement issue. That's a people issue.
Right. And
the fact remains is that until the mindset of the professionals align themselves so that they see themselves on an equal level with the CIO and the CFO and having a right to be at the table. I mean, that's really the key that has to be faced. Because if you go back and let's look at that CPO agenda roundtable discussion, they're saying the best people to run a procurement department is someone who doesn't have a procurement background. They also said during that session, which I found very interesting, is that they take one strategic procurement professional over 10 or 12 run-of-the-mill buyers. Mm-hmm. Think about that definition back in 2007. Run-of-the-mill buyers and one strategic thinker. A strategic thinker, I believe, is someone who's willing to step up and take the risk, step up and move outside of the functional framework that they've been confined to, partly by themselves, partly by circumstance, and move forward. But the problems with procurement isn't that people don't realize its strategic importance. The problem is, how do you deal with people in the procurement world who aren't ready to step forward and take a more responsible role? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and Kelly, I'm interested. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I actually agree with a piece of what each of you is saying. I agree with you, Phil. I don't think people perceive procurement as being strategic, as being value-oriented. I definitely think there's that lingering perception that we're tactical, we're boring, we're administrative, we are to be looked past and whenever possible worked around. But Jon, I agree with you that we don't have a choice. And I think the nice thing about the alignment of being the most unbelievable corporate underdog that ever was, and having a fire at our back that's forcing us to push forward and to stop asking permission and to do these things, is that we get to sort of make a sneak attack. And one of the stories that captures this that we tell in the book, and we actually use Winston Churchill's example of the story, as we talk about the story of the Spanish prisoner. So there's this guy that's been trapped in prison for many, many years, despairing the fact that he's never going to get out. And one day, he stands up and decides to try the door, and it's never been locked. And one of the things that we're saying is that, yeah, this cage exists, and whether procurement built it to make us feel safe, whether we're sort of crate trained in sort of dog parlance, or whether we have, in fact, been in prison, it's just time to get up and get moving. And if that means that we end up changing perception of procurement in our current situation, or whether it prepares us to join a more energetic, proactive procurement function in another organization, either way, we don't have the option to let things stay where we are. Right. We need to take active steps towards making a change.
You talk about an artisan skill set being required to kind of affect that change. So I was interested to understand, what does that look like? What do the skill sets of tomorrow look like versus perhaps, a traditional buyer?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost is there's a couple elements there. I think, first of all, we have to look at the broader enterprise holistically. Mm-hmm. We can no longer put on blinders and think of it, again, as a functional job of where we buy something and get the best price. I think we have to look at it and say, what is our impact horizontally? And the procurement professionals have to look at that and say, okay, why are we strategic now? Why is everyone talking procurement now? Why are CFOs and CIOs looking at procurement as being an important element of a successful business? And not just, again, as a needed function that can sort of be off in the corner somewhere. So you have to have an understanding of your impact. You have to have an understanding of managing relationships. We're in a relationship world now. And that means that we're not only talking about dealing with internal stakeholders, which is important, but we also have to understand external stakeholders in our view with suppliers and relationships in that regard. And that's where we have to change our mindset. In the past, a lot of people would look at suppliers as somebody, again, that you try to get the best price from, or you wouldn't look at it from the strategic standpoint of engagement and having an open transparency, especially when you get into more complex procurement. I mean, that's really a key part of it. I mean, and that's something that's important to touch on here. There are many elements of buying and indirect materials, direct materials, but if you look at high turn commodity items, you don't need a whole lot of expertise in that regard. You need access to the widest range of potential suppliers possible because there's very little after acquisition relationship needed. However, when you get into complex contracting, you have to be a proficient at building relationships. You have to create a trust rapport. You have to create a transparency that was never there before and flies in the face of what procurement professionals are. I mean, Tim Cummins, we talk about this, said that it is not uncommon for senior stakeholders around the negotiating table to lie to one another about what they can do, by when they can do it, and for how much they can do it. Think about that. That's a common factor that filters down. And so everyone's holding their cards close to their vest, and no one's really actually communicating and building a relationship, an open book relationship, as Kate talks about and as Andy Akrush talks about in terms of the new relationship paradigm in contracting. That's his book. But the key is we have to become adept at building rapport and relationships, which I think we haven't been very good at. And that goes back to, Phil, I think what you had said earlier, is when people talk about a bad experience with purchasing or procurement, that's a relationship issue. Yeah. And so those are just two of the immediate ones that come to my mind.
And if I can add to what Jon was just saying, sure. I remember as clear as day the afternoon we actually hashed out that notion of artisan procurement. And where we actually started was looking at sort of an entrepreneurial mindset and what are the traits and skills that allow someone to start a successful company. And yet, despite how successful those people are, often repeatedly, they all get to the point where they are no longer the right person to run that company. Mm-hmm. There comes a time where things need to shift. And so we started talking about what you need to scale and what is transactional and where you need consistency versus where you need somebody that's coloring outside the lines a little bit. And so before I think of anything artisan, I think of, handcrafts, woven baskets, anything with pottery. So you're dealing with an absolute blank canvas, and your effort results in something concrete. But for true artists, it's never about the basket or the pot or whatever it happens to be. It's about the process, because they get there and they do it again, and they try a new technique and they do it again. So for procurement, I think we're sort of at this shift where we need to hand a lot of our work off to either third-party service providers or run it through automation, and we're saving a much smaller portion of our work to be managed in a project-based, everything is a one-off kind of artisan thing, where it really is about the process. It's not about getting to 1.7 cents worth of savings per unit as fast as you possibly can. It's about actually creating something that changes the environment that you're working in. And I think that's that idea about shifting how we work.
And something that you mentioned actually that really resonated with me in the book was talking about that we have to learn to sell and have a business development mindset. And it's something that I think that we struggle with as a profession, because that's just not how we were educated within the profession to think.
No, that's absolutely true. And in some cases, it's as simple, and we talk about, it's a little bit out of style, but I think it's still important. We talk about the elevator pitch. I think everybody in procurement has been in the situation where you're at a family gathering, you're at a party, you're at some sort of networking deal, and somebody says, "Oh, hi, nice to meet you. What do you do?" And you're thinking, "Oh, great. Now I got to try to explain again what procurement is."
Right.
Most of us can't even explain what our function does briefly and in a compelling fashion, let alone make the pitch for something we want to accomplish. And it's something that we need to practice. It goes back to that thing about needing to evangelize what we're capable of and the difference that procurement can mean, not just to the bottom line, but to the overall operational health of the enterprise through how we, like Jon was saying with collaboration, how do we bring our suppliers in? How good are we at making decisions about what information to share externally at what time so that they can help us accomplish more? We can no longer just carte blanche, knowledge is power, hold everything as close to us as we possibly can. because we're artificially constraining our own capabilities. And it's some of those things that we have to open ourselves to that truthfully are scary, and they require us to not only take risks, but at a high level to change how we feel about risk. And this is part of sort of the perfect storm, current circumstances of where procurement is.
Right.
Where as a function, there are some of these things that we need to start doing differently or start doing to any extent. And if we don't do them internally, the fact that organizations need proactive risk assessment and risk management and strategies put in place, that's going to make the decision for us if we don't do it internally on our own.
Right.
So we need to start in 360 degrees thinking differently about risk. You can't just spend endless sums to eliminate it. It's never going to happen. You have to be open and prepared to deal with the eventuality that some of the risks are going to come to fruition. Mm-hmm. And whether that happens to be in taking a chance and making a pitch for something really unique and revolutionary at the C-level, or whether it happens to be putting a very different kind of supplier agreement in place, the entire landscape inside and out of companies has shifted in such a way that we need to take a positive attitude about these things, or we're going to be doing a subpar job and sitting in a conference room somewhere raising our hand when the wacky guy at the front with the microphone asks, who wishes they worked somewhere other than procurement right now? That's just not where we want to be.
Yeah, you see, there's an interesting thing, though, Kelly, and I want to add to it, the shift that's happening. One of the interesting factors, there is also a shift happening in the CIO world, in terms of IT, and even to a lesser degree in the finance world. I mean, a couple of years ago, in CIO magazine, they talked about actually changing their designation from chief information officer to reflect something that was more encompassing of a broader view of the industry, because a lot of people would say high-tech people would lock themselves in their labs and they were technology people. Leave us alone and let us work in isolation to a certain degree. So there is a major change on the entire landscape within the enterprise itself. So the traditional, and I think this is key for procurement professionals to remember, is that CIOs are changing. CFO functions, mm-hmm. I mean, they're staying within the same realm, but there's changes that are happening there as well. So we're at a unique period in time, a crossroads again, where these different functions and their importance within an enterprise is being redefined. And so what's happening now is going to reshape not just our profession for the next 10 or 20 years, but it's going to shape and create, and redefine these other functions within the enterprise as well. I mean, there's talk of a new position within organizations starting to emerge more and more called chief relationship officers, CROs. Which could become the one carrying the biggest stick at the table. So we have to be mindful that we can't view this change from an isolated or myopic view just as it relates to us. We have to also be aware of the changes that are happening around us in these other areas, which are being redefined, and in some cases dramatically.
And so I'm mindful of time, and I know we've talked a little bit about things that kind of are challenges and how we can change and kind of improve on ourselves. So I want to finish on a bright note, and you kind of alluded a little bit to it as the organizations around us are changing. And you said earlier, Jon, about procurement being a diamond in the rough somewhat. So what do you feel that we can be? What can we become?
Well, honestly, I think that procurement professionals can, if they realize their full potential, can take on a role. And I'll start off by this, because this is a common denominator that everyone will relate to. We will have a seat at the table, and we will, in our own right, have the CEO's ear. We'll have the board's ear. So I'm going to start off by saying that. Now, what does that mean? That means that we will not be on the outside looking in. The days of us merely following marching orders, which I think still exists today to a certain degree. We'll be able to veto deals if we don't feel right about it. Right now, I'm covering a story out of Manitoba, where Manitoba Hydro did a single source contract for $85 million. It wasn't tendered. And one of the debate is single source contracts, Are they good? Are they bad? And a response came from Colin Cram, who you may or may not know. He's out of the UK. Said that there's an inherent risk for single source contracts, but the risk originates with who holds the purse strings, as opposed to the procurement people. And he said the procurement people have to get to the stage where they can veto a deal if they feel it doesn't make sense. That's a kind of self-determination control that they can go to and say, look, this department wants to buy it, finance has approved it, but we don't approve it because we don't believe it's the best. And I think that's really a key point right there. It's the matter of the fact is that procurement can step up and veto a big deal if it doesn't make sense strategically, if it doesn't make sense from a procurement standpoint, from a stakeholder relationship standpoint. That's the exciting part about where we can get to. I like that. That means that we are a player in the game and that our voice is being heard and respected because we've earned it, because we have the expertise in terms of understanding the strategic landscape of what we do, and we have the ability to influence the decision rather than merely acting as a fulfiller of that decision. Do you know what I'm saying, Phil?
Yeah, no, that makes sense in terms of as having a greater say rather than somebody who is merely acting on orders, I think he said before, which to some extent we do. I think as we grow and evolve, then we come to a position where our professional opinion is respected as anybody else at the table.
And that's the key, and I believe that that's where the great equalizer is coming now. And I think that's where the greater movement will happen with the up-and-coming generation who know technology as well as anybody in IT. I mean, I think there's a lot of interchangeability in terms of functionality of understanding finance and IT and procurement. And the one who encompasses all those different skill sets can rise to the top. I mean, Toshiba, Kelly, who the person who took the helm of that company, the CEO, was actually the head of supply chain?
It was, yes.
I mean, that's if you want to know what the possibility of procurement is, that's what it is.
And I think Tim Cook at Apple was supply chain as well, wasn't he, before he became CEO?
True enough. Yeah, and those are the examples of where we can go. If you would ask a procurement, and maybe the question, Phil, we have to ask, just like we did at that Virginia conference, where we said, how many would choose to be in the profession and knowing what they know now? And the numbers were shocking. There were some senior execs there who were floored that only 50% would still stay in procurement or choose procurement. I think the reality is if you ask people and I don't want to make this a generational thing, yet it is to a certain degree. If you ask people who've been in procurement for 10, 15 years, can you be CEO of the company? I would hazard a guess that a very small percentage of them would say yes. And this up-and-coming generation, if you ask that, and I think that's maybe a question for 2 years down the road from now, but if you ask the up-and-coming generation, can be CEO of a company, I would hazard a guess that a greater percentage would say yes.
No, that's a really good point. Kelly, I'm interested in your perspective.
I think that, yes, there is a generational aspect to it. And I think that on the one hand, it has a lot to do with their native digital upbringing and their affinity for technology. But I also think that especially as within procurement technology becomes, somewhat commoditized. I think it's going to have less to do with that and more to do with their attitudes about information and how you share information and how you use information. I think that's what's ultimately really going to change the potential of the next group of leaders. And one of the things that I was thinking about a moment ago when you had asked, John, sort of where in fact are we going from here? Where do we want to see the profession go? I think back to the prior conversation you and I had in the podcast about supply market intelligence, where we talked about the difference between information and intelligence. And when I apply that inside of an organization, I think of finance as being the information, and I think of procurement ideally as being the intelligence, because they are so tied by reporting requirements and regulations. And if you start playing fast and loose with numbers, especially if you're a publicly traded company, the SEC is going to be very unhappy with you. So you have to be very straight-laced and very black and white in terms of how you approach things. But as procurement gets an opportunity to free themselves up from a bottom-line focus, when we start focusing all the way from the top to every operational level involving external relationships and the movement of spend right down through the bottom line, I think it positions us to become the ones who know what's really going on. And the power of that is that not only do we have all of this information that we get to spin and make recommendations based on in the form of intelligence, but it also gives us an opportunity to apply that knowledge at different points. Mm-hmm. If we have a good understanding of what direct and indirect costs are going to be going forward over time or based on some kind of seasonal cycle, the more we get involved at the sales or the business development side of the business, the better. And we get to become these carriers of information that helps figure out how things can be done better. And so I have this mental image of if, in fact, we do get that seat at the table, you sort of imagine finance being in the very buttoned-up suit. Everything is just so. It's dark. It's somber. It's following the rules. I would like to be procurement sitting just next to that person, sleeves rolled up, right, tie loosened, top button undone. Go ahead, ask him for the official version. But when you want to talk about not only what's really going on, but what's possible, what's forward-looking and what's possible, then you talk to procurement. And if that means we need to start recruiting differently or we need to rename the function, whatever changes that requires, I think that's what gives us the opportunity to do what we were talking about before. Mm-hmm. Just start doing the work. Just do the job, and everything else will catch up. But if we wait to be asked to sort of change the way we approach things, so many opportunities are going to go by the wayside, not only to improve things for ourselves, but to make our companies work better. And that's an opportunity, in my opinion, not to be missed, that hopefully comes through as excitement and enthusiasm for procurement's future in this book.
Yeah, and I think, so we've been talking, I can't believe, almost an hour, and I think that's a really good place to kind of leave it, is to think that, we can, it's in our hands, let's be the change that we want to see, if you will. We can start being proactive in pushing what we want to become to our organizations, because often they may not even understand it, and they're not going to come to us and ask for it. With that in mind, I just want to thank you both for your time today. I'm going to include links to both of your contact details and to the book, along with links to any of the other material and books that we discussed today, and they're going to be on the Art of Procurement website, and that will be at artofprocurement.com/crossroads. That's artofprocurement.com/crossroads. And it's funny, I go into each one of these discussions and I have a flow kind of to keep things moving in a certain direction. And this is the first time, kind of in the first couple of minutes, I threw that out the window because it's such an engaging debate. I wanted to make sure that we kind of weren't constrained by some points that I thought were important to bring out of the book, and because I think there's so much to talk about and we could have probably talked for a lot longer. So with that being said,
well, and Phil, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to mention this is now proven one thing though, is that I am the shy, timid one, and Kelly's the troublemaker.
Right. I know, John, you and I could have had a perfectly civil conversation that was just Kelly's just been stirring the pot. So I think we point our fingers at Kelly.
Hey, somebody's got to keep it interesting.
Right.
Thank you, Phil.
No, thank you very much. Again, the links are going to be at artofprocurement.com/crossroads. So, John, Kelly, thank you. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.